All right, you want to start?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for coming. George Washington had many careers. He was a teenage surveyor, and then he joined and eventually led the Virginia militia. Then he hooked up with Martha Washington, and he retired from the Virginia militia. And in his life there as a planter and a married man, he got himself elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. And he got up on this occasion when he was 27 or 28 to give his maiden speech in the House of Burgesses, and nothing came out of his mouth. So after a few minutes or moments, the Speaker of the House said, "Thank you, Mr. Washington," and he sat down. He wasn't a great public speaker, Washington, but he was adequate. He had to address the troops, and so he could project his voice and be understood. But Jefferson was a worse public speaker, and Jefferson hardly ever made a public speech. Thank you, sir. Take one of those. So the story of George Washington begins, actually, I believe, with the English Civil War. And that was the Parliament took upon itself to have a fight with Charles I. They defeated Charles I. This goes back to the 1642 was the beginning of the English Civil War. They beheaded Charles I, which they were never forgiven for. But then the Parliament, they were known as the Puritan Roundheads. They had that funny haircut like you put a bowl on their head. And they were severe religious people, and they defeated the troops of Charles I, the Royalists. And the Puritans then began to get rid of the Royalists to a certain extent. And in that group was one John Washington, who was George Washington's great-grandfather. He was an Anglican minister, and the Puritans knocked him out of his ministry and brought accusations against him. But it was really just this battle between the Puritans and the Royalists. Now, some of the Royalists, fearing for their lives, scattered, and some of them came to Northern Virginia. And actually, Washington is from this line of Royalist members, Royalist Brits who came to the different colonies, especially Virginia. So Washington's, this Anglican minister had a son, and his name was, the Anglican minister was Lawrence Washington. There's a lot of Lawrences and a lot of Johns. And John Washington is got on a boat and came to Virginia, where the boat became disabled. And then he ended up staying, and it was this area of northern Virginia between the Rappahannock River and the Potomac. This area is known as the northern neck of Virginia. So he married a girl named Ann Pope, and the father, his new father-in-law, gave him a wedding gift of land, and the creek there is named Pope's Creek. And that's the same area that Washington will be born in. So then what happened was that Charles II, the son of Charles I, while he was in Europe planning his eventual successful return, he gave out land grants to some of the loyalists. And one royalist was named Fairfax, Lord Fairfax. And the sixth Lord Fairfax would eventually move to Virginia, and he was given an enormous tract of land, maybe 5 million acres. There was tremendous litigation over this tract of land, but he won. This the sixth Lord Fairfax. And now another thing of note from the English Civil War is that the Puritans called the Royalists by what they thought was a derogatory name, and that name was to call them Cavaliers. But the Royalists loved that title. A Cavalier is the same, it's like the English equivalent of a musketeer, a French musketeer. It's a finely dressed man who goes off to battle and has a sense of honor. And I am, in effect, describing George Washington himself. And the University of Virginia calls their teams the Cavaliers, because that's their line going back to the English Civil War. So now moving forward, we come to 1688, when something occurs in England that they call the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution was the Protestants of England making sure that the Catholics did not establish themselves. So what happened is that Charles was Catholic. Then he had no children, and anyway, the Protestants, who now, the Parliament was establishing itself, they made a deal with William of Orange, a Dutch William of Orange, and Mary, his English wife, that they would come and take over the monarchy. But there was a written agreement as to some critical matters. One is that Parliament was supreme. And a key part of the supremacy of Parliament was that only Parliament could initiate taxation. So the king was giving up the right to impose taxes, a tremendous right. Now he was at the mercy, ultimately, of Parliament. The power to tax is, at the core of power. Now, we have that actually in our own government. It's not that well known, but only the House of Representatives actually has the power to initiate tax bills. And that comes directly from the English experience. Now, another thing that happened during this 1688 Glorious Revolution was that the king agreed, that's William, and Mary, they agreed that they would not establish a standing army. So from that point on, there is a split in the British military. And the split is that we always hear about His Majesty's boat, His Majesty's ship. The king controls the Navy, but the army is actually technically, legally, a branch of Parliament. So, they were very successful militarily, the British, so this split in command was not handicapping to them, except sometimes it was, as we'll get to later. So John Washington comes here, marries Ann Pope, and then he has a son, George Washington's grandfather, whose name is Lawrence. It goes John Lawrence, like that. And he marries a 14-year-old girl, and he's a successful man. Now, the original forebear I mentioned was an Oxford man. The Washingtons are literate people. All of these men have high writing skills, and we have a proof of that from Augustine Washington. Augustine is Washington's father. Washington's father contracted with the builder to build a new house there on that land. Actually, it's a house where George Washington would be born. But the builder died during the building, and Augustine Washington wanted some of his money back. And during that litigation, he submitted a very complicated detail of his claim, which is, I don't include it in my handout, but it demonstrates that Augustine Washington, George Washington's father, was a very literate man. So now, Lawrence Washington gets married to a 14-year-old woman, and which was not uncommon, 14, 15, 16. And there's three of them. Augustine has a brother and a sister, and then Lawrence dies. And this is in 1698. So the mother remarries, and the stepfather takes Augustine and the other two siblings and brings them to the north part of England on the Atlantic, because he was part of that Atlantic trade, the stepfather. And he was a man of means, and they came with money, he believed, and he enrolls them in the Appleby School there in, I think it's Wakefield, England. And it's a very fine school which exists today, and it was a very fine school then. And Augustine had a good time there in that school until he came to the age of 9. Now, back in Virginia, a cousin said that there was a problem with this stepfather being in control and gaining the money that the Washington children had. And he brought litigation in Virginia, and he won the case in Virginia, and lo and behold, Augustine and the two siblings were returned to Virginia. So then Augustine turns 18, and he is of maturity, and he gets his inheritance, and he's a man of means, and he's a big guy. He's 6 feet tall. I'll pause at this moment to discuss the height of George Washington. George Washington was mismeasured in his casket. He was measured at 6'4", but he wasn't 6'4". And it's really not known how tall George Washington was, except I discovered the clue. The clue is that Washington was a tad smaller than Jefferson. Washington didn't care how tall he was, but Jefferson is measured at 6'2½". So we could put Washington in there at 6'2 3/4". So anyway, he was a tall man like his father, and the father was a very strong man. And Lawrence marries a very nice wife named Jane Butler. Now, she came from a high-level family, and everything was going smoothly, except that Augustine Washington, like George, was a man who liked to be in motion. George Washington must have been the most traveled man of the colonial period. And the father also had this desire to travel. Now, the father began an iron ore business outside of Fredericksburg. This is very critical. George Washington's father became more of a miner than he was a planter. And he then traveled with Lawrence. Lawrence was his firstborn son. He goes to England, he takes Lawrence with him, and he enrolls Lawrence in the Appleby School. He then has meetings with this mining company, the Principal Mining Company, which is in Maryland and London, and he signs an agreement with them. Now he travels back, and the whole trip took 9 months. And when he gets back to Virginia, he discovers that he's been a widower for 8 months. His Jane Butler has died, leaving him with the 3 kids. So he has a lawyer, a well-known lawyer there in the Northern Neck, whose name is George Eskridge. And George Eskridge undoubtedly informs Augustine Washington that, by the way, there is this woman, not a young woman, a 23-year-old woman, who is an orphan, and I'm affiliated with her. He wasn't her guardian, but he was kind of her guardian. And she comes with land. So Augustine Washington meets Jane Butler, Jane Ball. He meets Jane Ball. Jane Ball, one second, please. Jane Ball seems to be of good stock. Her father is Joseph Ball, an established lawyer, and Joseph Ball has 5 children, one of whom is also named Joseph Ball, and his son is also a lawyer. And these Balls are litigious. The litigation that they entered into in Virginia and London is like documented. Anyway, Augustine meets Mary Ball, and he marries her. He marries her, but there's a problem. And the problem that George Washington had was that his mother was a very troubled lady. Now, the historians basically have negative things to say about George Washington's mother. Some of the things they say about George Washington's mother are that she's incompetent, crude, imperious, selfish, unloving. Flexner calls her, in his Indispensable Man biography, calls her a termagant. Ron Chernow, Hamilton's biographer, who followed that up with a Washington biography, calls Washington's mother crude, illiterate, self-centered, slovenly. Okay? And then, further, he calls her stubborn and difficult, and that's not untypical of the criticism of George Washington's mother. But really, I think the appropriate way to describe Mary Ball Washington is that she had a significant personality disorder. It was nothing, it wasn't a mood disorder where she was one day nice and one day irritated. She was always irritated. Always complaining. And so we don't know that much about her day-to-day conduct, but we can kind of piece it together by things we know occurred. Now, what occurred George Washington lived in really 3 places. Oh. Well, it's not here. Let me see. Let me take out a map here.
He slept here, slept there.
So George Washington was born on the Potomac, off the Potomac, that's Pope's Creek, which was not far from the opening of the Potomac into the Atlantic. Now, the English settlers thought this was great. They should live and work right off the Atlantic because they wanted to get into their British boats and go back to London. They wanted to ship their goods. If you got your goods, everything was shipped in kegs. You roll your kegs onto the boat, you could be paid or you could get insured. It was secure once it was on the boat. So these lands, which were right next to the Atlantic, had that great advantage of being close to the sailing vessels. This whole settlement of America is during the period of sailing. And all of the cities, New York, Newport, all of them are on the Atlantic. So there's a problem, though, with these lands that are right on the Atlantic, and that is that they're filled with mosquitoes and other insects. And it's impossible to farm some of these lands. Even today, they're not farmed. The land by George Washington's birthplace, which is called Wakefield, is not farmed because they still have the mosquitoes there. So when George Washington was 3 years old, the father moved up the Potomac to what we now call Mount Vernon. And he's there from the ages of 3 to 6. And it's an isolated place. It was an isolated place at that time, Mount Vernon. And he was we might say that he was unhappy there. And he was unhappy until the age of 6, when who arrives from England but Lawrence. Lawrence, 20-year-old Lawrence, who's 14 years older than him, has completed his education at the Appleby School and is now here, and he's a great guy, and Washington is happy. Washington is especially happy because his own father, Augustine, is what we call today an absentee father. Why would he be an absentee father? Because he has this very difficult wife in the house. So he spends his time away from the house, traveling to England, traveling to other properties. So he's got an absentee father, and there he is, just with his mother. And now Lawrence is here, and it's great. Now, I have got to go back at this point. I've skipped over Mary Ball's situation. Mary Ball, as I mentioned, her last name Ball, her father was Joseph Ball. But who was Joseph Ball? Joseph Ball, his wife dies when he's about 59 years old. And in a scandalous way, then, even today it's scandalous, he then marries his housekeeper. So the housekeeper, whose name is Mary Johnson. Mary Johnson is a very capable lady, very capable housekeeper, and a good wife. So he marries her, and eventually they have George Washington's mother, Mary, also named Mary. That was very common at that time. Mary, Jane. That's how they named them. But not strangely, or somewhat strangely, there is no notation of the day that the marriage took place or the day that Mary Ball is born. And the obvious deduction that we can make from this is that they're hiding the fact that George Washington's grandmother was pregnant at the time she got married to George Washington's father, George Washington's grandfather. And so it was not only scandalous, but it was against the law, and the laws were somewhat severe. So nothing happened to them, and the girl was born, and everything seemed normal. Now, what happens is that Joseph Ball dies. He dies when Mary's less than 2. And he leaves his wife, Mary Johnson Ball, his wife, he leaves her a life estate in this new house that he's built. Joseph Ball has 2 houses. The original house, he builds a second house. He builds the second house, it seems, for his second wife. Now he leaves her a life estate, and now she's fine. She can live there and, just use the timber and things like that and farm the land. But instead of enjoying her life estate, George Washington's grandmother marries a third time. She marries a man named Richard Hughes. But Richard Hughes has no children. You see, Joseph Ball came with 5 kids who were litigious. So this was cramping the style of the life estate. But it's even more than that, because Richard Hughes, having no children, when he died just a few years later, Mary Johnson inherited the property and her children. And now they were secure in this property. So it seems that George Washington's grandmother was probably, she signed her name with an X. But just because you signed your name with an X, it didn't mean you couldn't read somewhat. But she was a very capable lady. But we could see that she was very busy with Joseph Ball. She was busy with the third husband. And what happened to her baby Mary? It seems that baby Mary didn't get that maternal attention that she needed, and she turned out in a very difficult way. She was not a poor girl, but she was very difficult. So she becomes an orphan at the age of 12. And of course, when you're 13, 14, 15, you can get married. And she was a nice-looking lady. But nobody wanted to marry her until Augustine Washington showed up. Now, there's a very significant fact on this map, which says on it, Mary Washington's Accokeek land. George Washington's mother, was left that little piece of land. You could see it, it's like a worm there. She was left those 600 acres by her stepbrother. In other words, not a stepbrother, her half-brother, John Johnson. Going back, the grandmother marries Joseph Ball, and she comes into that marriage with two children, Elizabeth Johnson and John Johnson. Joseph Ball dies. She remarries Richard Hughes. Okay? Richard Hughes leaves his stepson, John Johnson, this 600 acres. So, when Augustine Washington gets off the boat and discovers that he's a widower, and the lawyer, George Eskridge, is informing him about this orphan, a 23-year-old, something's wrong, but she comes with that 600 acres. And he's a land-hungry guy, Augustine Washington. And people made these marriages then and even now for assets. So he decides he's going to marry her, get the land, and put up with her, but she's an awful lot to put up with. That's the problem. So George Washington now is living with this very difficult mother. This is a mother, my belief is that George Washington was never hugged by his mother. George Washington had a problem, not just relating to women, but to relating to men as well as women. Now, there's a lot of people who describe, well, he was George Washington's friend. But when you look into it, they were good, they corresponded with each other, but he just didn't have close friends. He did have one, which I'll get to. But what George Washington really liked was the camaraderie of fellow soldiers. This is what worked for him. Being with his fellow soldiers, fighting, then eating together, living together. This guy tells a story. This guy sings a little British ditty. And this kind of camaraderie was very, very appealing to George Washington. So going back to 6-year-old George Washington, he's suffering there with his mother and his absentee father, and Lawrence arrives. Now, Augustine has made a trip to England the year before, and it's obvious to me that Augustine has set up a certain plan. And the plan is that when Lawrence comes from England, he's going to turn over what we know today as Mount Vernon was called then Little Hunting Creek. And Augustine Washington buys another piece of property near Fredericksburg, because that's near the mine. So just a short while after Lawrence arrives, Augustine packs up George and his younger brothers and sisters, and they go down to Fredericksburg in what we call today Ferry Farm. So when they get to Ferry Farm, where George Washington lives in Fredericksburg from the age of 6 really through the age of 14, 15, or 16, that was his childhood place, Fredericksburg, Virginia. And this is where the cherry tree story might or might not have occurred. Now, what is the cherry tree story? It's not that George Washington chopped down the cherry tree. It's that the cherry tree was barked, that a hatchet was whacked into the cherry tree, going into the bark such that the cherry tree would not be able to survive. So there's something that's not well known about Washington, and that is that he had an angry streak. George Washington had an angry streak from childhood through his presidency. And we know that because Jefferson, Secretary of State Jefferson, writes in his diary, "Oh, President Washington went off again today." So this angry streak, knowing that he had an angry streak, and knowing that Lawrence was up there, north, back in Little Hunting Creek, well, what have you done to me here? Now, according to the story, Washington gets a gift of a hatchet. So, you just connect the dots. It seems the ring of truth that Washington would whack the tree. And the story, now the story was revealed by the first biographer of Washington named Parson Weems. Parson Weems was kind of a self-promoting guy, and the historians beat up on him. And they say, look, this story about the cherry tree, it doesn't appear until the 5th edition. So, isn't that suspicious, the 5th edition? He made it up. It's a myth. But I say, and others say, but the historians more say it's a myth. But there is a certain school of thought that says it's not a myth. And it seems an angry boy with a hatchet, would whack a tree. There's plenty of trees around. So now the father says, who whacked the cherry tree? Now, the evidence is against Washington. It's obvious he was given a hatchet. There's a hatchet mark in the tree. So Washington just adds it up and says, okay, I did it. I cannot tell a lie. And the father in the story gives him a hug. Your honesty is worth more to me than, the tree. So anyway, Washington is suffering there. We don't know too much about it. But the next big event that takes place is that the next big event concerns Lawrence. Now, his picture is there in your handout. That is Lawrence Washington. And what happens is that the British decide to attack the Spanish in the Caribbean. And they raise an American colonial army, a regular army. And Lawrence Washington raises troops, and he's gone on this military adventure more than 2 years, from the beginning to the end. So he leaves in October of 1740, and he doesn't come back until January of 43. Now, this must have been very distressing to George Washington, but it happened. His wonderful older brother. Now, if you go to Mount Vernon today and you go to George Washington's study, there's just one picture in George Washington's study, and that's the picture of Lawrence that I've duplicated there. So Now the story shifts to Lawrence. Lawrence goes down to the Caribbean with his troops. I mean, there were other troops. He wasn't the leader of the troops, but he was the leader of maybe 200 men. And they're on the boats. And the boats are being controlled by Admiral Vernon. And they're there. The plan is to attack the fort at Cartagena, which is Colombia today. But the troops, as I told you, there's a split. The troops are by a General Wentworth. And Wentworth delays the attack. The fort is very formidable. There's an outer part to the fort, then there's an inner part to the fort. So while this delay is going on, something nice happens to Lawrence, Washington. What happens is that Admiral Vernon takes Lawrence onto his flagship. Now, this is not just a nice gesture, but it's very important for Lawrence because the sailors on the flagship, because they're the most experienced ones, they have the most immunity to these terrible shipborne diseases. So that's a great positive for being on Admiral Vernon's flagship. Eventually, Lawrence Washington comes back to his estate and he renames it Mount Vernon after the admiral that he connected with and who was good to him. Now, back to Lawrence. He never gets off the ship to attack at Cartagena. Wentworth, the general, keeps them on the ship. He doesn't believe that they're good troops. And eventually they attack, and the attack fails. They get through the outer part of the fort. But when they get to the inner part of the fort, the ladders don't reach to the top. So they call off the attack, and by the time they're being decimated by diseases, and then the rains come. As soon as the rains come, it's like raining, in the Caribbean, downpours, and the whole thing is called off. And that's it. It's a failure. Lawrence comes back having been on a failed mission. There is another attack. There are some other attacks, but it's not clear at all that Lawrence Washington ever was successfully part of any attack. But he comes back, and there was something like 500 men on the attack, and 50 come back. They lost 19 out of 20 men. Now, when Lawrence comes back, he's weakened by malaria. And this is very significant because being weakened by malaria, his whole constitution, his whole immune system is reduced. This allows another disease to attack him. We know that disease today is tuberculosis. I believe today that 1 out of 20 Americans has encapsulated tuberculosis in their lungs. It's not a problem. It's not a problem unless you come down with, say, a mononucleosis or another debilitating disease, and then that somehow the encapsulated tuberculosis comes forth. So he now is coughing, Lawrence, and he's fighting this disease that we know as tuberculosis. And he's advised to go to Barbados, avoid the harsh Virginia winter, and spend a pleasant time in Barbados. And he asks Brother George to go with him, and George goes with him. This is the only time that George Washington is out of the United States. And he has a grand time, except one bad thing happens. George Washington is attacked by a mild case of smallpox. Excuse me for a second. George Washington had a few pockmarks on his face and on his cheeks. Nothing really noteworthy. But there is a problem. There's a problem that doesn't really show itself until he's married. And it seems that the smallpox has rendered George Washington infertile. George Washington never had any children. Martha Washington had a first marriage to a rich guy named Daniel Parke Custis. And with Daniel Parke Custis, she gave birth to 4 children, 2 of whom survived infancy and eventually came the stepchildren to George Washington. A boy named Jackie, a bad boy named Jackie, and a nice girl named Patsy. Patsy was the nickname for Martha. They had these established nicknames, and Martha Washington was also known as Patsy, and her daughter was also known as Patsy. So George Washington, his father dies when he's 11. And now Lawrence, I left something out here. When Lawrence comes back from his failed military adventure and he goes to Little Hunting Creek, he discovers that right in the adjoining property, the adjoining estate has been bought by William Fairfax, who is the land agent and the cousin of the 6th Lord Fairfax. And William Fairfax is a very powerful man and a well-to-do man. And really, Lawrence and George Washington become Fairfax men. William Fairfax has a hot daughter, 16-year-old Anne, and there's a whole story with her, but I won't digress into that. But she ends up rather immediately marrying Lawrence Washington. So, but what happens, Lawrence comes back, and then the father dies. Augustine dies. Augustine dies suddenly, and George Washington is 11 when the father dies. And, but he's got Lawrence. He's got his substitute father, and there's another brother. The other brother's named Austin. So he also was in the Appleby School. He also comes back. So he has his 2 brothers, and Washington got up every morning of his life and did a tremendous correspondence. And we have many of his letters, diary entries. Not that he wrote, you know, the most interesting stuff, but he wrote at least 10,000 kinds of writings. And he practically never mentions his father. So it would be very easy for him to have mentioned his father, to say, well, my father bought this great place, you know, Mount Vernon. But he never says anything like that. Because really, you get the impression he was distant from his father because the father was staying away because the mother was so problematic. So now an incident occurs, and that is that Lawrence and William Fairfax put together a plan that 14-year-old George Washington should join the Navy. And George Washington says, if my brother Lawrence wants me to do it, I'll do it. And he packs his bags. Now, we don't know exactly why he didn't go into the Navy. But, I mean, the mother is the one that queers the deal. Mary Washington does not let her son join the Navy. And actually, it's a difficult life in the Navy. So, in this case, maybe the mother's intervention was not a bad idea. When he can't get into the Navy, he then turns, and he ends up being a land surveyor. William Fairfax has a daughter, Anne, and he has a son, George Fairfax. George Fairfax is 7 years older than George, but George Washington is a very tall kid and a very serious kid. And George Fairfax is kind of a nerd. So George Fairfax and George Washington become close friends. And then there's a surveying trip, and George Washington is invited to go with George Fairfax with the senior surveyors and survey Western lands. And he goes, and this is his first taste of surveying, and he comes back, and he breaks out his father's surveying tools, and with some instruction, he then kind of teaches himself to be a surveyor. And because he's now really affiliated with the Fairfax, he gets surveying jobs, and he's very good at it. There's no criticism of George Washington. He's a top surveyor, and he's earning a living at surveying. So when the father dies, George Washington is 11. Now, there's something, the few things about Mary, his mother, and one is that it seems that George Washington was never hit by his parents. It wasn't the style of the Virginia upper middle class. They weren't from the top families of Washington. They were from a notch below the top families. And they didn't hit their boys. If you give a beating to your enslaved people, that they could, but you didn't give a beating to your no good sons. So when the father, you see, going back to the cherry tree story, when George Washington says, yeah, I whacked the cherry tree, he knew he wasn't going to be hit. It's not like the father was going to take off his belt. So that was another little piece of the puzzle, why George Washington was so, unafraid to declare that he did it. So George Washington becomes a surveyor, but what happens is that he stops really living with his mother. Now, we don't know exactly when the mechanism. We just know that he goes to live with Austin. Austin is living in the birthplace. And it's not clear that the mother ever gave her permission. He didn't ask for permission. He becomes independent of the mother. The mother can't hit him. He's not relying on his mother's money. And he just becomes an independent teenager. Then finally, when he's 16, that's when he jumps and moves. He actually moves into the Fairfax estate. But the Fairfax estate and Mount Vernon are right next to each other. And George Washington almost is the connecting piece between the two estates. George Washington was a great fox hunter. He was one of the most outstanding horsemen of his time. So William Fairfax and the old man, Lord Fairfax, they liked to go fox hunting. And George Washington was almost obsessed with fox hunting. According to certain diary entries, in one 2-week period, he once went fox hunting 8 times. And he would go by himself. He would just do it all by himself, which is a little unusual. So he became a favored person there of the Fairfaxes, William Fairfax and also of Lord Fairfax. And George Fairfax, his friend, was engaged to be married to a certain Sally Carey. And during this period, George Washington develops a crush on his friend's girlfriend, who then becomes his friend's wife. And he takes dance lessons to get ready for the marriage. And he was known as a great dancer, Washington. It's a little surprising, but during the Revolutionary War in the North, during the winter, when there was no fighting one year, not in the beginning, but after the things settled down, there at one of their winter balls, he danced with Kitty Green, the wife of General Nathaniel Greene. He danced continuously for 3 hours. Everyone was there watching it, and I don't know. It was a strange story, but that was, he was a great dancer. He was a very athletic guy, and a great horseman, and but he knew how to dance with women, but he didn't know how to relate to women. That really was part of the problem, and. So going back, George Washington, after Lawrence dies, Lawrence Washington had a military position with the Virginia militia. He was the adjutant. And Washington was 18 or 19, and he applied, but he was too young to get that position. And so the Virginia governor gave him like a partial, put him in charge of a portion of the militia. And then Washington is given an assignment, a very unusual assignment, to go tell the French to get out of the Ohio Valley. And Washington and another woodsman travel hundreds of miles in the winter through the raw American heartland, and they find the French, and they say, oh, he's sent by the King of England, you have to leave. And the French laugh, and they treat him nicely, and so then they leave. Washington and the other guy, whose name is Gist, leave. And something unusual happens, which Gist writes about. Washington wrote a famous journal of the trip. The journal, which he gave to the governor of Virginia, was then published in London and throughout the colonies. But Gist also wrote a journal. So in the journal, they both describe that an Indian appears, a Native American appears, who says, oh, I'm going to assist you, to find your way back. And so they're going along. And then after some hours, the Indian turns around, the Native American, and he has a gun. And he's shooting at them just from a few feet away. But it misfires, and they don't get hit. And Gist says, well, we have to kill him. What are we going to do with him? If we let him go, if we don't kill him, then he can easily follow us and threaten us and kill us. So we have to kill him. But Washington won't do it. Washington says, no, we're not going to. I can't be, Washington won't go along with that. So eventually they let him go, and then they hustle this way, and they have to hustle because they're very concerned for their lives. So it was the other guy wanted to take care of his own safety, but Washington wouldn't do it. Washington was one of those generals eventually who was concerned about the lives of his men. Some generals, like say Napoleon, sends his troops into battle. If they die, they're dying for glory. The important thing is to win the battle, no matter how many die, 10,000s, tens of thousands. But Washington wasn't that way. And the men sensed it, that he wasn't, during the American Revolution, that he was careful about these situations. And that's one of the reasons Washington was really loved by his men, is that he didn't, he spent their blood very carefully. So Washington comes back, and his status is rising there, and he's in the Virginia militia, and his brother has died, and he rents Mount Vernon from his sister-in-law, and then he eventually inherits. Lawrence had a baby daughter who died. George Washington actually inherited Mount Vernon when the baby daughter died. So eventually Washington inherits Mount Vernon, and now the Virginia governor decides, at the direction of London, they're going to send the Virginia troops to chase the French out. First it was just get out, the message. Now there was a senior guy in charge of it, but the senior guy died, and then Washington was in charge of it. And Washington actually fired the first shots of the French and Indian War. We call it the French and Indian War. The Europeans call it the 7 Years' War between England and France. So the French always said that Washington, was like an assassination. Washington gets the drop on these Frenchmen. Washington had Indian allies. They said the French are here. And, the important thing in warfare is that you live. Not that you follow the rules of warfare, but that you live. So he was a young soldier. He said, fire, let's go. And he fired too. And they killed a number of Frenchmen in a firefight. And later on, just a few weeks later, the Frenchman they killed was a diplomat. The French claimed, and so then Washington retreated, and for some reason he didn't run all the way back. He retreated, and he built a little fort called Fort Necessity. He called it Fort Necessity. And then the French came with a larger group and attacked. And then the rains came, and it was, the French were picking them off and killing them. And then finally the French said, look, we'll let you go. Just you can walk out. But you got to sign this document. And Washington didn't read French. So there was a translator. Washington signed it. And then a French later on said, you see, you admitted you assassinated the guy. See, right there, you admitted you assassinated. Now, the historians say, Washington was defeated. But he walked out with his troops. He walked out. Is that a defeat? It's not, that's not being captured. He was respected by the people in Virginia, and his status rose. And then the British sent an army with a guy named Braddock, General Braddock. And Braddock, was a huffy-puffy British general who believed that the British troops could defeat any situation. And he marched headlong into the French and the Indians, and it was a trap. They were all trapped, and the Indians started whooping, and they were all scared of being scalped, and they panicked, the British troops, and it was a wipeout. It was a massacre. Now, Washington was sick. Washington had such a bad back that he was actually being carried on a wagon, because he couldn't ride. But when the fighting started, he amazingly got off the wagon, got on his horse, and stayed on the horse for the next 24 hours. And he organized the retreat, and he ended up burying Braddock, who died. And when he got back to Virginia, his respect went even higher. Then the British, they never give up. They sent another army under a guy named Forbes. And by this time, the French realized that the jig was up. The English had many times the population of the French population. My own opinion is that the weather is lousy in England, and the weather is better in parts of France. So the English people wanted to come here because it was sunny here. This is just my own speculation. But the English population was too great for the French population. The French wanted to build a string of forts from Louisiana to Quebec. You see, that was their idea, a string of forts. But the British were the British, and they just gave up. And the fort that they were fighting over was in Pittsburgh. Now, on the way to this, what might have been a battle, it turned out it wasn't a battle. Washington writes a letter, which is in your handout. Now, this letter is actually the most famous love letter in American history. Okay? If there's another love letter, you're welcome to let me know. It's in September, and he's there, so he might be facing a battle where he might die. And he's writing to Sarah, but, she was known as Sally Fairfax, the wife of his friend. And he's writing in code. He's trying to disguise the fact that he's writing, in effect, a love letter to his friend's wife. And he says at one point here that he's a votary to love. And this is known as the votary to love letter. And you see, he never says, I love you. And it seems like he's writing about Martha. But he's not. Now, I missed a big story here, which I have to go back to. So George Washington is single, and this is before he meets Martha. George Washington is really not connected to any girlfriend, to any sex life at all before Martha. Now, there were opportunities for men. There was plenty of women that you could hire, lower class women, were available everywhere. Then it's not really commented on, but some American soldiers had sex with American Indian girls. I mean, the tribe would bring you in, they'd make you a tribe member for the night, so that would, you became legitimate, and then they had a more open sense of the situation. But Washington is not connected. There's no evidence of any girlfriend. There's no evidence of any liaison. It's possible that he went into the marriage with Martha, without sexual experience. Now, Martha had a boy and a girl. And the girl, Patsy, had epilepsy. And eventually, when she's about 17, she dies of an epileptic fit. And Washington notes it in his diary. Poor Patsy died. Now, eventually, his stepson, Jackie, would die. But when no good Jackie dies, Washington just says, Jackie passed away. You see? Washington seems to have had an emotional attachment to his stepdaughter, Patsy. And you see, when Washington became a surveyor, a legitimate guy, a worker, there was another path that he could have taken. And the other path is the path that a lot of Virginia boys took, which is not talked about, but existed, very much so existed. And that path was one of, they used code words for it, like dissolute life or words like that. And that meant that the Virginia boys would drink and go down to the slave quarters and have sex with the slave girls. Now, we know a guy who had sex with the slaves, and that's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, it's established by DNA, had a long sexual history with Sally Hemings, but nobody really says, was Sally Hemings the first enslaved girl that Thomas Jefferson had sex with? Really? He's in his 20s. He owns all these slaves. His father died. He's the master of the house. So Jackie, George Washington's stepson, Jackie Parke Custis, one teacher said he's a very poor student, and he has a very high sense of voluptuousness, which is a code word for the fact that he was sexually active somehow. Anyway, Jackie ended up forcing a marriage, meaning that he probably had sex with a girl, but he married a very established girl, and they had 4 children, 3 daughters and a boy. The boy was named after George Washington. The boy was named George Washington Parke Custis, and he was known as Washy, and he was a fat kid, and he was known as Wash Tub. He grew up to be a famous guy in Washington, D.C., George Washington Parke Custis, because what happened was when George Washington had no children, the youngest 2 of Jackie's 4, the youngest boy and the youngest girl, were informally adopted by George and Martha. And there's many pictures, of which I have one, and it says Washington and his family, but he had no children. But the family is Martha's grandchildren, Jackie and Patsy. So that boy, who was famous in Washington, D.C., eventually wrote his recollections, which you can buy, and I have a copy. And in those recollections, he reveals how Martha and George met, which was always a mystery. How did they meet? They never told anybody how they met. And there was just speculation, that somehow they had met. But this story, which I say has the ring of truth, it's there, is that Washington had gone from Mount Vernon down to Williamsburg to see a doctor because he suffered from various intestinal ailments, as everybody did in those times. And he was on the way back, and he crowded across the ferry at Pamunkey Creek. These ferries were all on private property. It was a ferryman, and they were just on private property. And so he's waiting to take the ferry at this certain gentleman's property, and the gentleman comes out and says, Colonel Washington, would you have dinner with me? Now, dinner at that time started at 3. 3 o'clock was the meal. You'd eat from, you'd get up with the sun and have a light breakfast. George Washington ate corn cakes in the morning. Anyway, then at 3, you had the big meal. So Washington said, well, look, thanks for the invite, but, got to go. And the guy said, please, I have a guest here, the widow, Martha Parcustis, and, I said, I would try to get you. And it's okay, he says, I'll go. So he had a well-known, what they call a body slave, named William Lee, Billy Lee. And the story is that Billy Lee says, so should I leave the saddles on the horse? Meaning, we're just going to be a couple of hours, or should I take the saddles off? He says, leave the saddles on the horse. But Washington stays until dawn the next day. The story is related by Washington's stepson, is that they eat dinner, and then after the dinner, lo and behold, everybody's cleared out. It's just him and Martha. Martha has arranged for them to be in a private setting. And this is the start of their relationship. I mean, I'm not saying that, George Washington was the type of guy to, consummate a relationship. That wasn't his orientation. But he comes back a week later, and he tips the servants a very large amount of money. But they actually kind of privately considered themselves engaged. But they didn't announce an engagement. But they considered themselves engaged, apparently. So then that happens in March of 1758. Now it's September of 1758. And he writes this letter to Sally, which was when Sally died in England, her estate in the 1880s announced this letter. And it was a big scandal that Washington, wrote a love letter while he was engaged to Martha. And supposedly J.P. Morgan bought the letter and buried it. But the letter is there, I think, at Harvard, but it's not there's the letter. And my explanation of the letter is that George Washington, felt somehow, he was in love with Sally. He had known Sally, and he was in love with Sally, and he was taking a shot at it. But she never answers the letter, but she saves it, and it ends up being saved for more than 100 years. And, he felt in a way, I didn't choose Martha. Martha chose me. And Sally's unhappy with George Fairfax, who's kind of a nerdy guy. And he went with his feelings, and he wrote the letter. So nothing came of the letter. The French left, and In December, he resigned from the militia, and in January of 1759, he marries Martha. Then they stay married, and of course, they were always married. But you have to believe that, they tried to conceive children. I mean, there's nothing else but to think that, the marriage was consummated, but then they discovered somehow it wasn't working. The magic wasn't working. She had given birth to 4 children, and he had smallpox. So what happens is that the Fairfaxes, because George Fairfax wanted somehow to get part of his uncle's vast estate, he had to stay a loyalist. And Sally and George Fairfax left the Virginia, returned to England, never to come back. They never returned. So the other thing that happens in June of 1773 is that Patsy Washington, as I mentioned, dies of epilepsy. June of 1773. Now, August of 1773. Sally Fairfax and George Fairfax were the close friends of George and Martha. They came over all the time, and they dined together, they played cards together. The whole thing settled down, his interest in Sally she became a friend, but now these two twin emotional things happen. They leave, and Patsy dies. He has no children, and he's lost his friends. And it's at this moment that Washington becomes very active in the revolution. So you have to say to yourself, if George Washington had had children, 2, 3, 4 children, would he have plunged into the Revolutionary War the same way as the way he did with no children? To me, it's clear, the fact that he had no children was very significant. I think, George Washington is called the indispensable man. And I think he was the indispensable man. And he not only leads the revolution, he then comes back and leads he becomes the president for the Constitution, and he then becomes the president. So, but, he really, he was the most important figure in American history all the way up. There was no other figure which was comparable to him. Franklin was an important figure, but Franklin lived 25 out of the last 30 years of his life in Europe. So Franklin was very well known, but he didn't have the personal impact of Washington. Washington was the commander-in-chief to hundreds and hundreds of officers. And there were, during the course of the 8-Year War, 200,000 men were in and out of the Continental Army, and he was the commander-in-chief. So he had an influence on the whole American, really the American personality. He established himself as an honest guy. He gave up power as the general. He gave up power as the president. He didn't, he tried to hire people who merited the job. He didn't hire his friends or the sons of his friends. Of course, he didn't have too many close friends. But anyway, so he connected to Martha. They had a good marriage. She was a wonderful wife, very supportive. She's a very intelligent woman, Martha, and backed him all the way, never complained when he took off, and she visited him every winter. She came up to visit him, and, you know, they formed the leading couple, and nobody complains about George Washington. They don't complain about Martha. You know, she really, she was a great lady to be a partner with him. So anyway, there's a little bit more to the Washington story, but I see I'm running out of time. George Washington, let me just say a few things about Hamilton. Everybody's interested in Hamilton. Hamilton was a very, very capable guy who set up an artillery unit in New York, his own independent artillery unit. And the first act of the American Revolution is up in Boston. There's the Battle of Bunker Hill, and Washington's not there. He comes up afterwards, and the British leave. There's a siege, and Henry Knox brings in guns in a remarkable way from Fort Ticonderoga. Washington gets the guns in the mountains over the harbor, and the British wake up, and these guns could blow up the whole ship. And they eventually make a deal with Washington. We'll leave, you don't blow up the ships. You blow up the ships, we burn the town. So they made a deal, the British Navy took off. They went to Halifax, and then they came back, and everybody knew they were coming to New York. So Washington came down to New York, and that was the start of the war there in New York. And it was a disaster in the beginning, and then Washington realizes he has to retreat, and he retreats to Trenton, and there's a great victory at Trenton. And the victory at Trenton really changed the whole tone of the war, because the New Jersey had been the breadbasket of the British Army. But once they were overwhelmed at Trenton, they never felt comfortable leaving the troops there. Would another Trenton happen? So they had a fight for food. They brought a lot of their food in from England, which was a long way away. So that victory at Trenton was a great victory, and then the follow-up victories at Princeton and at Princeton, with those two victories. I mean, it was the 10 days that changed the world, they say. But Hamilton. Hamilton was, as Washington is retreating south and crossing the Raritan River, he notices that the artillery is very effective in punishing the British who are following him. And then it turns out that that's Hamilton. And he sees immediately that Hamilton is this really very extremely capable guy, and he invites him in to his headquarters. Washington wanted what he called penmen. They would write the letter, he would sign the letter. Hamilton knew what Washington wanted to write. More, okay, you want that? And he became really the second in command at the headquarters. So then they were together, and Hamilton really wanted to go fight in the field, but, Washington, never would let him go. Until Hamilton had no family. His mother had died back in the Caribbean, and he never knew his father, and he never knew his brother. So the army was his family, and they all blended together in a very nice way. Hamilton and Lafayette were extremely close. They were so close that Chernow, in his Hamilton book, feels obligated to address the fact that they might have had physical contact. But Chernow says they didn't, and it doesn't seem like they would do such a thing. But they were extremely close. Hamilton spoke French. So then Hamilton meets Liza, the daughter of General, help me please, General Schuyler, thank you. So Schuyler is Dutch, okay? And the reality is that Schuyler himself had to marry his wife because she was pregnant. Because the Dutch had a different attitude about sex than the English did. So then the third sister, Eliza, the Schuyler sisters.
You remember them all.
The Schuyler sisters. Oh, my daughter knows, but she's not here. Anyway, the song from Hamilton is there about the three of them. But she had to get married too. So, Hamilton was a sexed up guy. Eventually, the Washingtons adopted a cat. And it was a tomcat. And as a joke, Martha named the cat Hamilton. Because Hamilton was going off at night, it would seem, looking for women. And anyway, Washington, he was a straight-laced guy. And the reality is that Washington had trouble being close with people. He never revealed himself. When you come from a background, as he did, with this very problematic mother, he never wanted to talk about his mother. He never wanted to talk about himself. He wasn't a personable guy. He was a guy who talked about crops. He talked about horses. He talked about dogs. He talked about politics. But nobody ever wrote anything that said, well, Washington and I had a lot to drink, and he told me this, he revealed this. Never. So after Hamilton met Liza, and of course I'm implying that they had, sex together, he then picks a fight with Washington. And the fight is that, as I said, Washington was punctual, and Hamilton is delayed talking to Lafayette. And Washington says, in an irked way, you kept me waiting. And Hamilton says, okay, I kept you waiting, you're irked, that's it, it's goodbye. And he walks out. So Washington immediately sends some of the guys, bring him back, let's calm it down, everything's good. No, Hamilton will not be calmed down because he has Liza now. He's got somebody. And Liza comes with his whole family, So he agrees to stay on a few more weeks just to, ease things through. And then he leaves, and he writes a letter to his future father-in-law, Schuyler, in which he says, really, we were never close. Because Washington, he did form close relationships. I mean, but it was all subtle. His aides had to, they realized they understood who he was, and it was limited, and, he's the kind of guy who would say good morning and remember your birthday, but he wasn't personable. And it didn't do it for Hamilton. So they were never close. But when finally Washington and the French went marching down, because they had the English cornered at Yorktown, and the French fleet came up remarkably and wouldn't let the British Navy rescue them. Washington marched down from New York, and they sailed down, and they were there at Yorktown. Hamilton got word of it, and he had never turned in his commission. And he said, hey, I worked for you. I was your main man. Give me my glory. And Washington, because he was soft on Hamilton, of course, later on he would appoint him the Secretary of the Treasury. Washington says, okay, you got it. So the British had two little fortifications outside of their main army, redoubts they're called. And Hamilton led the charge on one of the redoubts. And he told his men, no guns. We're going in, don't load your guns. We're just going in with bayonets. And they went in and they jumped over, whooping like Indians. And the British said, well, what's going on? And they took the redoubt with a very small loss of life. The French took the other redoubt, and it was a bloody mess. There was a lot of death on both sides. So Hamilton got his glory there, which Washington gave him. So that's the Hamilton and the Washington thing. Now, after the British finally left in November 25th, 1783, they finally left New York Harbor, and they got on their boats. They played a trick on the Americans. They greased the flagpole. So the Americans wanted to run up the American flag, but they couldn't because they couldn't get up. But it took them hours to get up. So that was in November. In December, Washington calls his generals in to Fraunces Tavern. And the whole thing is, he says, that's it, I'm leaving, I'm cashing it in. And he cries. He cries there in Fraunces Tavern. And when they see him crying, they're all crying. It's a cry fest. Washington, tears, Knox, all of that. He hugs them. The guy who... Washington had a thing about physical contact. And it became, during the Constitutional Convention, there was a certain man who was kind of friendly with Washington named Gouverneur Morris, who was known, had a reputation as a ladies' man and a wise guy. And he made a bet with Hamilton. Hamilton said, go up to Washington, put your arm around him, okay? And, slap him on the back, and I'll buy you and your friends dinner. So Gouverneur Morris says, I'll do it. And he puts his arm around Washington. He says, how's it going there? And Washington looks at him like, with the eyes. And later on, Gouverneur Morris said, yeah, I won the bet, but it wasn't worth it. Because they knew that Washington didn't want that physical contact. You see, that goes back, I think, to his mother. You see the hugs. And he just didn't know, he knew how to dance with a woman, but he didn't know how to, hold hands with her. You see, he was handicapped in that way. So anyway, Washington left Fraunces Tavern, and he went down to the Continental Congress. It wasn't the Continental Congress, it was the Convention Congress, the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress in Annapolis, and he handed in his commission, as Commander-in-Chief. He said, I'm resigned. They knew what they were all there for. He said, by the way, could you give me back the document? I want to save it for my heirs. But he cried again. He cried again there in Annapolis. He had just cried 2 weeks before, and again he cried. And they all cried again. But nobody ever called him a crybaby. And then that was the end of his military career. So I see my time is up, and I think I'm going to end it right there. I'll take one question. Anybody have a question? No questions. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.